There was a mathematician, a physicist, and an engineer who were staying at a hotel. And fire broke out in each of their rooms in the nighttime. And the engineer woke up in the middle of the night. He saw the fire. He saw the water in the bucket. The ice melted. He dashed across the room, got the bucket, poured it over the water, and put out the fire. In the next room, the physicist woke up. And he saw the fire. He saw the water. He quickly dashed across the room to the telephone, called up the engineer in the next room and said, "Come on over and put out the fire. I'll tell you how to do it." In the third room, the mathematician woke up. He saw the fire, saw the water, and says, "A solution exists." And he went back to sleep. In spite of that, I am a mathematician. And my job with the Department of Defense was I was the person responsible for developing the mathematical tools that we use to break foreign diplomatic military codes. So that was my job. And I had about 35 people working for me, mathematicians, engineers, and other people that we won't mention. So here's the talk about Torah. We're going to talk about him, which is no surprise. Anyone know who that is? Anyone recognize the picture? That's a picture of the Vilna Gaon, the Gaon of Vilna, one of the great sages of all time. Gaon in Hebrew means genius. And it's no surprise that we're going to be talking about him, but we'll also be talking about him. Anyone recognize who that is? Osama bin Laden, that's right. We'll be also talking about the space shuttle. And what does all this have to do with a quiet beach somewhere in Thailand? So we're going to try to tie all this together. Now, first of all, the question is, what is the Torah? Well, you probably sort of know, but I think there's an important point to make over here that not everyone is aware of, and it's very important for this class. And that is that the Torah, our tradition tells us, is about approximately 3,300 years old. However, the entire world, even the Arabs, agree, the Muslims agree, that the Torah is a minimum of 2,000 years old. And that's because it was translated into the Greek under the reign of Ptolemy II of Alexandria, and it therefore entered Western culture. It was translated at that time as the ancient document of the Hebrews. But for our purposes, minimum 2,000 years. No one can dispute that. It's common knowledge. We're going to authenticate codes of the Torah with probability, or if you wish, odds. They're basically the same thing, just a different way of writing it. What is the probability that something that looks like a code could have just happened by chance? Now, why do we do that? Let me explain from the professional point of view. Supposing I were to tell my friend, somewhere in Europe, perhaps, or in America, it's really hot here. Now, does he really know what I mean? He knows that it's probably not very cold, but he doesn't really know how hot it is. I mean, is it hot relative to the way it is in Ukraine now in the wintertime, or in Siberia, or even in the northeastern parts of the United States? Or is it really, really hot compared to like anywhere? But if I tell him it's 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees centigrade, Celsius, then he knows exactly what I mean. And he can judge for himself whether he thinks that's hot or not hot. And that's what we want to do with these codes. We don't want to say, look at that, isn't that amazing? Well, maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. And some people will argue it is, some people will argue it isn't. So how do you get around the problem of it being subjective? And the way you do that is by being objective in a scientific way. That is, we measure as a number how unusual it is. We don't use our intuition. There's no intuition. If there's intuition involved, mathematically it's invalid. You may use your intuition in terms of what to look for, of course. You have to do that in any scientific endeavor. But when it comes time to making a decision, is this real or is it not real, you have to have an exact measure. And that measures probability. Is this something which you expect to see or not expect to see? And then the question is, well, how unexpected does it have to be before we're going to believe it? And we'll deal with that in just a few moments. I was once giving a talk on the codes in Johannesburg, South Africa. And I was trying to get this idea across to a high school class. There was this young boy by the name of Yossi. He was sitting in the second row on the left of me. If I just said on the left, that would be ambiguous. And I said to him, Yossi, imagine it's the first day of class. And there's a whole bunch of kids over there that you never saw before. They're coming for the first time. And you're all squeezing through the door, getting into the school, and he steps on your foot. Was it an accident or was it on purpose? And Yossi says, it was an accident. I said, good for you, Yossi. The next day, he steps on your foot again, the same kid. Accident or purpose? He says, accident. I said, okay, I'm impressed. Yossi, the third day, he steps on your foot again. Yossi? Yossi? Well, come on. Well, it's got to be one or the other. I guess it was an accident. Yossi, you're a righteous person. The fourth day he steps on your foot again. He's dead meat. True story. True story. So you see, the point is that a person stepping on your foot, it doesn't happen often, but it happens sometimes. You assume it's an accident. But when there's a consistency, when something seems to happen over and over and over again, there comes a point in time we decide, no, this is no accident. This is a setup of some sort. The addition that we're going to use in the mathematics is going to be how do you measure how much of a setup it is. Now, one of the things we need to make clear is that the codes of the Torah are not new. Beta Bachya, in his commentary in the 13th century, actually gives an example of an ELS code, and I haven't defined ELS yet, but I will do it in just a moment. And it's in the 16th century, Pardes Rimonim. And of course, the Vilna Gaon, who we just saw this picture a few moments ago in his book of Hidden Things, where he says that everything that ever was, is, or will be, is in the Torah, in detail. But of course, if you look at the Torah, you can read it from cover to cover, or from the first stick to the last stick, or whatever, and you're not going to find anything about, for example, Osama bin Laden. So it's got to be hidden in some way. It's got to be encoded in some way. What is new is the ability, number one, to find them with high-speed computers, and number two, to evaluate them in a purely scientific way. Now, what do I mean by a purely scientific way? I'll tell you what my standard is. My standard is that if I show someone what we're going to see, all the details, which you're not going to see, that's going to be left for another class, some of the details and how we do it, but the details of the mathematics of how it's done. And he said, I don't believe this stuff. And I say, you're entitled to your belief, free country. But if you're telling me that I'm wrong, show me where I made this thing. Put up or show up. Shut up. That's the criterion. You either can show me where I went wrong, or keep your mouth shut because you don't know what you're talking about. You want to share your belief with me? That's fine. I'm open to hear anything you want to believe in. But don't tell me I'm wrong if you can't tell me why I'm wrong. So this actually happened. I was giving a talk at the Torah Codes at a math conference, not Asia Torah, not any other keyword organization. It was a math conference in Hong Kong. We'll see it later. This is it was the 18th International Conference on Pattern Recognition. Purely mathematical conference on how to recognize different patterns. And I was presenting some of this stuff. And some mathematician came over to me, speaking a very heavy English accent. And he said to me, "What are you trying to do here? You're trying to prove God?" I looked him in the eye, and I said, God has nothing to do with what we're talking about here. I said, you've seen the data, you've seen the math, you've seen the process of the calculations. Can you find the flaw? And I kept my eye on him. 20 seconds of silence. And afterward he says, no, and walks away. Now, he probably didn't become a believer, but that's my criterion. So, now let's define what we mean by ELS. It's really, or it stands for equidistant letter sequence. It actually is exactly what it says. Take any text, not just the Torah, any text at all that you like, and you take a word or a phrase or whatever you want, and look for the first letter of your phrase somewhere in the document that you're looking at, in this case the Torah. And if you find it, you want to see if you can find all the remaining letters in a sequence of letters in the text that are equally spaced from each other. So in other words, from the first letter to the second letter, say 13 letters, and then another 13 letters, another 13. It could be 50, it could be 2079. It doesn't matter what the number is, so long as whatever the distance is from the first to the second is going to be the same as this distance from the second to the third to the fourth, and so on. And that's called the skip distance, for obvious reasons. Now, you see, the thing is, though, if you look at the example below, and by the way, we ignore spaces, so spaces are not counted. If you take a look at the example below, the word food is encoded there as an equally distant letter sequence, which shows you that you can find them in any text, not just the Torah, for example. And by the way, a true statement, which many critics will say, and it's true, and that is you can find these kind of things in any text. And the longer the text, the more you're going to find. That's going to be a challenge. We're going to have to deal with that. Okay, so keep that in mind. If I don't deal with it, call me up on it. Okay, the problem is, you can take a look at the red letters. If it wasn't in red, if it was only in blue, you'd have a hard time finding it. You'd have to spend either a lot of time and put it into a computer to find it, right? So we want to find an easier way to see them if they're there. We don't make them there, they've got to be there. But once they're there, we want a different way of displaying it. So here you have my name, Harold, and my name, Gans. You see, Harold is encoded in that sentence above, every 14 letters. So if I put it on a width of 14, see there's 14 letters on each line, then the H, the R, the O, L, D are all going to line up in a column. And then you see it's much easier to spot. Okay? Now, the Gans is encoded also, but it's encoded every 6 letters. And that's at the bottom, and it's going backwards, which is why you see it going up instead of down. Right? See in green, the G, A, and S. Now, there's also a way of displaying it, not always, but in some cases, and that's going to be the interesting ones, where you can see both at the same time. If I take a skip of 7 letters on each line, then 7 being half of 14, the Harold is going to go down every other line, right? Because you got to go 2 lines to get 14. The Gans, being 7 is 1 off from 6, so Gans is going to go up at a slope of 1. It's going to gain an extra if you go straight up and then over 1, straight up and over 1, and so on. And that way you can see them, and you can actually see that they actually intersect with the A. And we sometimes call that a code cylinder because you're sort of looking at this text wrapped around like a code, like a cylinder, in the sense that on the very top line, the I is followed by the S on the next line. So you're sort of going around and connecting, going around like in a helix. Now, a very important point is that an ELS is not necessarily a code. So when people say you can find ELSs in any document, it's true. But that's not what we're talking about, because ELS is only the first criterion that you need in order to have an ELS code. There are 2.5 more. I say 2.5 because we'll have to talk a little bit about number 3, but 2 is very important, and that is that it has to exhibit some structure, something about it that's extremely unusual. And we're going to have to be able to measure just how unusual it is. Okay? That's what's going to make the difference. When you find ELSs and other things like that in any text, you expect to find them. And you can calculate how often do I expect to find this, and you'll find it about that many times. When we look at the Torah, what we're looking for is something that you don't expect to find, in spite of the fact that the Torah is 304,805 letters long. Or the book of Genesis, 78,064 letters long. Okay? So that's going to have to go into the calculation. Don't worry, we're not going to do the calculations. Okay? No calculations, not in this class and not in a more advanced class that I'll be giving in a couple of weeks. It's all going to be for the layman. You don't have to be a mathematician. But I just mentioned the fact that that's one of the things that we'll have to consider. Okay? Now, number 3 is a little bit difficult. It's something called a priori. It's the least understood, and it's probably one of the most important things. The reason it's in gray instead of black, and I called it a half, is because you don't always need it, but you always want it. What a priori means is that if I'm going to show you a code with words, I've got to specify the words before we start. if I don't specify the words before we start, if we start looking around and say, oh, look a little bit over here, there's this word, oh, look over there, it doesn't count. It's not a priori. I didn't tell you what I'm looking for beforehand. See, think of Babe Ruth. Anyone know who Babe Ruth was? Everyone? Anyone not know who Babe Ruth was? Babe Ruth was a very, very famous, are you American? That's why. I say that's an easy way to pick out who's not American, right? Babe Ruth was a, you know what baseball is, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So Babe Ruth was a very, very famous baseball player. He was famous for many reasons. He was a great baseball player, but there was one thing he did that really, really sealed his fame. And that is in one game, he points in a certain direction, and when the ball is pitched to him, he hits it, it goes exactly where he pointed. That's amazing, because it shows that he has so much skill with the bat, that, and he doesn't control how the pitcher is pitching the ball, he can make it go wherever he wants. That's amazing, that's what he became famous for. Now, I want to ask you a question. He did two things, right? He pointed, he hit. What if I reverse them? Suppose he hit and then he pointed. Doesn't mean anything. It's the same thing, but it's a different order. It's not a priori anymore. That's what a priori. When he points first, he's saying that's where it's going to go. A priori. I'm specifying it beforehand. Now let's see if I can do it. When he points afterward, that's called a posterior. That's after the fact. You could have pointed anywhere. Well, of course, Babe Ruth might have said, you know, I really can make it go wherever I want, and I intended to point before, but I forgot, so I pointed afterward. And you know what? He might be telling the truth. But we have no way to know that. And as scientists, we have to say, well, you know, I'm not calling you a liar, but you need more to convince me. I'm not convinced, because you could have just made it up. Okay, so let's take a look at a few of the examples that we'll be dealing with here. One of them is where we have two ELSs that are very close to each other. Like you saw the Harold and the Gans, although not necessarily crossing each other. They're very, very close on a co-cylinder when we put it on a certain width. Okay? And it's got to be unexpected. It was given how long the book of Genesis is. So some of the research was done on the book of Genesis. Some of it is done on the whole Torah. Given how long the Torah is, this is still unexpected in spite of the size of the document. And there's an exact mathematical calculation which you put into the calculation. How big is the document? And it'll tell you whether it's expected or not. It depends also on the letters. You know, like for example, a hey is very common in Hebrew. A gimel is very uncommon. So if you have a word with a gimel, you don't expect to find this. Well, a hey you do, and so on. All that goes into the calculation. Complicated, but you know, doable. For a mathematician, it's no sweat. Okay, the second example is where the ELS is unexpectedly close to a verse on the co-cylinder. And how do you choose which verse? Because it's always going to be near some verse, right? So we'll have to deal with that. Well, we'll sort of deal with it. Okay, another example is where the skips between the letters are much shorter than you expect to find. Given the length of whatever it is you're looking for, you expect to find it the minimum at a big width, and you find it at a small width. And you can measure exactly how significant that is. And then there's very long phrases, for example, something which is very, very, just keeps on reading and reading, and if it's long enough, then in spite of the size of the Torah, it's going to be very significant. And then there are going to be esoteric observations. Things that are startling in the intuitive sense, but we don't know how to evaluate them. In this case, there's one. There are a few other esoteric observations. I think we'll deal with just one of them today. Now, in terms of probability, here we have 5 books. Okay, picture of 5 books. One of them is different than all the others. Does anyone see which one is different? Just raise your hand. Look here. Okay, a few people see it. Okay, fine. Now, supposing I were to take someone who wasn't in this room, blindfold him, bring him in here, and say, pick which book is the one that's different than all the others. And he would say, it's the second one from the right. Now, what would you think about that? Would you say, wow, how did he do that? I mean, that's amazing, right? No, it's only 1 in 5. Right? I mean, he was lucky. I mean, he'd have to do it a few more times before I begin to think, well, maybe he really does know how to do this, you know, right? I mean, everyone agreed 1 in 5 is better than 50-50 odds, but not much, okay? So this would not be significant. On the other hand, if I show you 1,000 red dots and one of them is different than all the others, and he can pick out which one out of the 1,000, I know for me, the first thing I would say is, excuse me, let me examine that blindfold. Right? Something is going on, because 1 in 1,000, that's not something you expect them to be able to do. Would everyone agree with that, pretty much? Okay, that's going to be the standard, it's going to be 1 in 1,000. It was not set by us, it was set by non-Jewish mathematicians who are peer reviewing the work. Now, one of the things about a priori is that a priori enables us, in most cases, to be able to calculate the probability, which is going to measure how significant it is. If it's not a priori, it's usually impossible to do so, although there are occasions where with enough effort you can, which is why it's not always necessary, but you don't want to really deal with the cases, although I did deal with one case that was very startling. I'll share that with you in the next codes class, in which we actually did calculate the probability for something which is quite amazing. Okay, so we come to the Vilna Gaon. Lived from 1720 to 1797, and this code was found by Doron Vitztum in the 1980s. Doron Vitztum is one of the two original researchers into the Torah, scientific study of the Torah codes. The other one is Professor Eliyahu Rips, who's a professor of mathematics at the Hebrew University. Now here we have a relatively short piece of Sefer Bereshis, and if you look at it in blue, you see, you could read the highlighted letters, Hagoin, and in red, Mei Vilna. That's his official name in Hebrew, Hagoin Mei Vilna, the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon is sort of English with a little Hebrew in there, but in Hebrew you would say Hagoin Mei Vilna. The Gaon, the sage, the genius from Vilna, which is where he lived. Notice how close they are. In fact, if you take a look, you'll see that two of the letters actually are adjacent to each other. Now, if you calculate the probability of this happening just by chance, it's about 11,000 to 1, 1 in 11,000, which is very significant. But there's a big but. Anyone guess what the but is?
We found it afterwards.
What? Someone said
We
something?
found it afterwards. It
I'm
wasn't
sorry.
our priori.
That's right. We don't know that it's a priori. Now, Wisdom may say so, and I personally trust Wisdom because I know him for many, many years, but from a scientific point of view, I don't trust anybody. Put the proof on the table. That's the criterion here. So it could be very significant, but we don't know for sure because maybe he did this whole thing with 10,000 or 20,000 different rabbis and their known, the appellations that they're known by. And out of the 20,000, he found one, and that's the one he shows us. You know what that would be like? Ever see anyone watch a movie about Robin Hood? Anyone? Remember, he shoots the arrow and it goes right through the apple on top of someone's head, right? Now, how did they do that? Well, nowadays it's easy, but how did they do it way back when, before there were special effects, electronically and all that? What they could have done is they have him shoot an arrow, okay, and he misses. Of course, first they give him archery lessons, fine, so he doesn't miss all the time, but and he does it 20,000 times. And finally, he gets it, but they film each one. They show you the one in which he succeeds. They don't show you all the ones in which he failed. If they would show you all the ones in which he failed, you say, well, so what? I mean, if I do it 20,000 times, I'd probably hit it also. That's the idea over here. Now, that's not all that we have over here, because here's exactly the same Hagoin Mei Vilna, but in green, going up at a slant, you see B'Yud Nisan. That's his date of birth. Okay, now the probability of that happening is about 1 in 3,000. But again, we don't know that it's a priori. Maybe he not only looked for the date of birth, he looked for the date of death. And by the way, I'm not going to show it to you, but we find the date of death like this also. But he could have looked for all kinds of other dates that are associated with the Vilna Gaon's life. The day that he went to yeshiva, the date that he got married, the date that he had children, whatever it is, And out of all of them, he found one. So again, but you see, the point over here is that Wisdom, and now Rips, who was involved in the research as well, understood this. They understood that this is not going to convince anybody. And so they had to design an experiment that was a priori, in which everything was specified beforehand, and no one could try to say, no, well, you did this, you did that, it's a priori. And that's this, the Great Rabbi's Experiment. Number one, he takes the names of the great rabbis, like the Vilna Gaon is one of them, out of an encyclopedia of names of great sages between the 9th and 18th century. Okay? So now you can't say, well, why did you choose this name instead of that one? I took all the names that fit certain criteria that are in the encyclopedia. Okay? There had to be enough of an article written about him and so on. So he was great. The dates of birth and death, you saw the date of birth over here. We're going to look at the dates of birth and death for all of them. It turns out there's 157 names, I believe, on the list. That was actually tried. Mathematical measure of closeness. You can't just say, yeah, that's kind of close. Well, maybe it's not so close. You have to have a mathematical measure, a number that tells you how close it is. And finally, the calculation of the probability of getting the set of closeness measures for all the pairs in the experiment, just by chance. That just happened by chance. Now, the probability that was required by the non-Jewish peer-reviewed mathematicians who were going to review this article for publication was 1 in 1,000. The usual is 1 in 20, sometimes 1 in 100. But you know what they said? They said, for this, it's got to be 1 in 1,000. You know why? Because very unusual claims require very unusual proof. Right? The weirder it is, the more proof you're going to require. Right? I mean, if someone told you that a flying saucer landed in Kikor Shabbos, for example, and you say, well, what's the proof? And you say, well, I saw it. You know, okay, fine, you know, really nice meeting you, okay, you know, if you said, well, I have a picture of it, well, you look at the picture and say, well, you know, how do you know the picture isn't fake? That's easy to fake, but, you know, you'd have to go down there and look at it yourself, maybe, and before you'd believe, hey, really, there really is a flying saucer here, right? By the way, just for the record, I don't believe in flying saucers, okay, so just an example. Okay. What they actually obtained when they did the experiment was 1 in 62,500, which is 62 times stronger than what the peer reviewers thought was a very strong threshold. Now they also did some sort of control experiments. Now what's a control experiment? A control experiment is where you do the same experiment over again, but you change something very slightly so that it shouldn't work. So, for example, in medical science, they always do controls, right? You have a drug, it seems to help for a certain disease. What do? They have a control group in which they give them a sugar capsule. It's called a placebo. It has no drug in it, but the people getting it don't know that. And then we see, what's the difference between getting the real medication and getting the placebo? The placebo is the control. You want to see there's a difference. Because if, let's say 5% of the people got better, and you say, wow, look at that, the medicine is working, 5% got better. Well, do control, look, they're getting 5% getting better over here also. So obviously this is not, the drug is not working. There's something else going on here that's causing them to get better 5% of the time. Maybe people just recover without anything 5% of the time. So that's what you want to do over here. You want to make the slightest change possible. And one of the things they did is they took the Samaritan version of our Torah. It's 98% the same as our Torah. The places in the beginning over here are highlighted, as you can see. A couple of 3 extra words inserted in one place. Most of the time it's just a difference in spelling, a vav, a yud, and so on. They do the same experiment on the Samaritan Torah. Now, if it succeeds, and you get a probability of 1 in 62,000 or something like that, you don't know what's going on, but you know that something is going on. It's not real, because you shouldn't be getting the result over here. It means you made a mistake somewhere, you better find it. But that's not the case. If you look at a chart, the most compact of all these pairs of names and dates, in the red you see the real data, the blue line tells you what you expect to find by chance, because you always expect to find something by chance. But over here you're finding 3 times more than you expect to find by chance. All the way on the left, the green is the Samaritan Torah. And as you can see, the average over there is a little bit above, a little bit below, but look at the contrast between all those red lines that are way above any of the green lines. It's telling you something is going on. And the control experiment verifies that. And like I say, this was one of about maybe half a dozen or more control experiments that were required by the peer reviewers. And it was published in Statistical Science in August of 1994, the last to next article, Equidistant Letter Sequences, the book of Genesis by Doron Vitzman and Elio Ritz. Yoav Rosenberg was the programmer, and the editor at that time, Professor Kass, wrote the following at the beginning of the whole issue, our referees were baffled. Their prior beliefs made them think the book of Genesis could not possibly contain meaningful references to modern-day individuals. Yet, when the authors carried out additional analyses and checks, the effect persisted. The paper is thus offered to statistical science readers as a challenging puzzle. Statistical science is one of the premier journals of statistics in the world. They don't fool around. And they say it's a challenging puzzle. Okay? So, of course, the critics took up the challenge. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next class. We'll also talk about why it says that they didn't think, their prior beliefs made them think the book of Genesis could not possibly contain meaningful references to modern-day individuals. Notice that's exactly what it is. We're talking about names and dates of birth and death of people who lived after the 9th century in a minimum 2,000-year-old document. Remember that? Which means the Torah is talking about things that weren't going to happen for another 1,000 years. The question is, can anyone else do it? And in California, in Los Angeles specifically, I get this question all the time. And that is, maybe aliens did it. We'll deal with that in the next class. We'll actually prove scientifically that aliens couldn't do it even if aliens were to exist. And I don't know if they do or not, so I'm going to ask. September 11th, because I was going to tell you a story at this point, and that is how I got involved in these Torah codes. Now, what happened was that I have a cousin, and he was in Jerusalem for a math conference. He's also a mathematician, runs in the family. And he met a mathematician that he had known from the University of California, Berkeley. And he saw him, and he thought it was him. And he went over and he said, "Are you Dave?" You know, he says, "Yeah." He says, "Well, what happened to you?" Because he was wearing a yarmulke, and my cousin remembered that he had been an atheist. And he said, "Well, you know, they showed me all these codes in the Torah." So he said, "You know, there are things encoded in the Torah from current events." I looked at him and said, "Mel, are you crazy? I never heard of such a thing. That's ridiculous." He said, "Well, I don't know. This guy is really smart. I mean, he's a mathematician at Berkeley, or he was. Now he isn't anymore. He's living in Arizona." But I said, "God, that's nonsense." And for about a year, I forgot about it. I wasn't going to waste my time on nonsense. And as far as I was concerned, I'm an extreme skeptic. So I considered it to be totally nonsense. About a year later, my wife went to a class. It wasn't on the Torah codes, but the teacher happened to mention the existence of these Torah codes. She came back and she said to me, "My dear husband, why don't you know there are these Torah codes? Why don't you get involved in this? Find out what it's all about." Now, why would she say that? Number one, I was interested in Torah, but more than that, I mean, here is a guy who is an expert in codes, professionally, 28 years of experience working with codes. If anyone's going to be interested in something like that, I said, it's just nonsense. But she knew me well enough to say, "My dear mathematician husband, have you proven that it's nonsense?" Well, she had a point. So I said, you know, just to keep my wife happy, which is a very important thing to do, by the way, even for mathematicians. I mean, I can tend to ignore her some of the time by just pretending to be thinking about all kinds of esoteric things, but it doesn't work all the time. In fact, I find that lately she doesn't fall for it anymore, and she's gotten wise. Anyway, so I said, "Okay, I'll prove to you that it's nonsense." But, being honest, I said, "Okay, I think it's going to be nonsense, but I'm wiping the slate clean. Wherever the research goes, that's where it leads me." The first thing was to find out what are these Torah codes, and I had no idea what they really were. And it turned out that there was an Arachim seminar. Anyone hear of Arachim? Arachim is another Kiruv organization here in Eretz Yisrael, but they deal with Israelis as opposed to English-speaking people. But a lot of the Discovery Seminar actually originated with Arachim, and it was translated into English by their people and given to Eish Torah. Of course, Eish Torah enhanced it a lot after that, but that's the origin of it. It came from Arachim. Anyway, it was an Arachim seminar, and they were going to be teaching the codes. So I said, "Okay, I'm going to go and find out what it's all about." But I wasn't going to go alone. See, because I have a very, very close friend who is 1,000 times smarter than I am. he's now retired, but he was a senior physicist at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. And he had a clearance which was probably about as high as my clearance, except a different kind of clearance. And so I asked him, he's a fun-loving guy too. Believe it or not, physicists can be fun-loving. Anyway, I said, you want to come around and find about the teeth? Yeah, you're on. So we traveled to New York. I live in Baltimore. It's about a 200-mile drive. And we got there, and sure enough, there's this guy presenting the codes. Very similar to not what I showed you now, but the stuff that I'm going to show you in a few minutes. And some of the codes that you've probably seen. And every time they would say, look at this, they were appealing to the intuition. And my friend and I would look at each other, it didn't satisfy us. After a while, the whole audience realized what was going on. Instead of looking at the screen, they would look at us. But then we talked about this great rabbi's experiment. And we looked at each other, and then everyone paid attention to the screen. After the class, I went up to the speaker and I said, do you have a paper on this? And they did. They had a preprint of the original, of the paper, which eventually was published. He gave me a copy of the preprint. I made a copy of it and gave it to my friend. We went home and we analyzed it. I analyzed it for 3 hours. I couldn't find the flaw in what they had done. And I'm very good at finding flaws. So I called up my friend and he said, what took you so long? I finished going through it 2 hours ago and I couldn't find the flaw either. I told you he was a genius, right? Anyway, so now I said, wow, Anyway, so to make a long story short, we brought our families to an Esher Torah Discovery Seminar in Baltimore, and I went over to the guy who was in charge at that time, and I said to him, by the way, if you ever need someone to present the codes, I think I could do that. And he said, don't call me, we'll call you. But a week or two later, they had a seminar going on in Denver. And what happened was their codes guy was a mathematician, but he was an Israeli. And his wife just had a baby and he couldn't come. So in desperation, help, we need a mathematician. Whoever thought, a plumber, an electrician, yeah, a mathematician. Anyway, so there I was presenting the codes for the first time. And afterward they said, listen, Winston and Rips are the only people who ever did this experiment. The only people in the world. He says, I would feel a lot more comfortable if someone else would do it. And you go ahead and reproduce their experiment and see if it really works. And they offered me a new computer. It was state-of-the-art laptop, state-of-the-art, like 20 meg of storage on the disk, right? Something like 8 megahertz. That was state-of-the-art at the time. Anyway, I went ahead and wrote my own programs. I just followed the directions that were in their preprint. I wrote my own programs, reproduced it, got exactly the same results. At which point I felt a chill go up my spine. Because I guess there was some disbelief in me until I actually saw it on my own computer, my own programs, doing the same thing. And then I thought to myself, you know what? Why not do another experiment, which came to be known as the cities experiment? And that is, substitute for the dates of birth and death, I'm going to substitute the cities of birth and death. And there's the cities experiment. We have, oh, there it goes, okay? So here, involved, now the very interesting thing, first of all the names and appellations are absolutely a priori. Why? Because they were already used in the Great Rabbi's experiment. They were all specified beforehand. I didn't change one. So no one can argue against the names. Jewish names and spellings of communities of birth and death were taken out of 2 encyclopedias. You can't argue with that. It was an algorithm contrived by Tzvi Yenbal, who at that time worked for Arachim, and you would just go through the algorithm, and without making any choices except exactly as was specified, go to which encyclopedia provided the most accurate spelling and so on. The compactness measures, the calculation probability, all done exactly the same as the Great Rabbi's experiment. All a priori. Can't argue with that because it was already done. It's not the first time. And it was peer-reviewed and published in the Proceedings of the 18th International Conference on Pattern Recognition, which I mentioned before. The probability that was attained was 1 in 250,000, much stronger than the other one. And if you ask what's the probability of both of them happening just by chance, it's 638 million to 1. And it too was peer-reviewed and published. There it is, the cover for the conference. International Conference on Pattern Recognition, took place in Hong Kong, August 2006, which is where the story that I told you before about this guy who came over to me and thought, what does it have to do with God and so on, came about. Now, come to 9/11. Now, this work was done by Eliyahu Rips, and to make sure that all the words were a priori, he took them out of a newspaper. And this is the headline on September 12th, the day after, in the Hebrew newspaper Mariv. And he picks out some keywords. These are the keywords. Mitkefet HaTerror, the terrorist attack. Notice, by the way, the newspapers, not us, use the word terror also, even though it's originally an English word, but it's become a Hebrew word as well. We're not inventing the word terror, it's a priori because it's taken from the Hebrew newspaper. Airplanes, matosim, on the left, you see Migdalei HaTa'omim, the Twin Towers, and again, matos, airplane. What is it telling you? These key words are telling you what happened, the terrorist attack, where it happened, the Twin Towers, how it happened, airplanes. Notice over here, it also says that between 10,000 and 25,000 people were killed in the Twin Towers. That was the initial reaction the day after the attack. And also the person responsible, Osama bin Laden, down on the bottom over there. And here's the code chart that was found by Eliyahu Rips. So here we have the Kefet, attack, Matos, airplane, Migdalei HaTa'omim, the Twin Towers. The probability obtained, and by the way, in the text, notice the word pamim twice. That raises a question. It doesn't answer the question, it raises the question, is there a relationship between the code and the text in which you find the code? We're going to have to watch out for that and see whether or not we can answer that question, or if there are other examples of it. But this is where the question comes up. And the probability obtained was 19,500 to 1, probably less than that, but the technique that was used gave an upper bound on the probability. So we know it wasn't greater than 19,455, it may or may not have been less. And it too was passed peer review by non-Jewish mathematicians and was published at the same conference that we mentioned before. Yes?
10,000 people didn't die in 9/11 though.
Ah, that's a very, very good point. We're going to deal with that. But that was in the newspaper, not the code. Remember? The newspaper said between 10 and 25,000 people. Over here, we didn't see anything about how many people died. Okay? So let's go on. And Osama bin Laden. A second, let me see, did I skip something? No. Okay. We're going to get to it later. Okay? I thought it was the next slide, but it's not. Okay, so Osama bin Laden. Now, this is, remember we talked about a phrase that's very long. This is the longest phrase, I think it's either 28 or 29 letters long of a code, continuous code. And what it basically says is, Harma Achancha, I will name you destruction. Now, Achancha has a very specific meaning in Hebrew. What it means is not just to simply give someone a name, like, some kid, somebody call another kid fatso or stupid or something like that. But it means this is your essence. Your essence is destruction. Or bin Laden, cursed is bin Laden. Now this is problematical. And the Kabbalah Mashiach, vengeance belongs to the Messiah. Now, that's ambiguous. That's why it's a question. What does it really mean? Now, this was found before bin Laden was assassinated. Okay? So, what we have over here is saying that somehow this bin Laden is associated as some kind of a vengeance for the Messiah. Now, could it be that the Messiah himself will come and wreak vengeance on bin Laden? At that time, we didn't know. Now, of course, we know that that wasn't the case. But we did consult several mukbalim at the time. They asked them, what does it mean? And they all said, three different people. Each one said the same thing. I don't know, but I'll tell you what I think it means. And each one said, I think that it means that bin Laden is going to be the Messiah's tool to wreaking vengeance on the world for all the destruction they caused to the Jewish people over the centuries, over the millennium. Be that as it may, this is the code. Now, notice that through the word Mashiach, Tamim, perfect. Again, something in the text that seems to be related. And through bin Laden, Shalem Yishalem, he shall surely pay. Again, it reinforces the question, is there a relationship between the code and the text in which the code appears? The probability, 2,500,000 to 1. It's the strongest probability for any code that we've ever found, just by the fact that it's so long. And we take into account, first of all, the fact that it's long, and the fact that it makes sense. And we can talk more about that in the next class. How do you find out if it makes sense? Because a computer doesn't usually know if something makes sense. It was actually peer-reviewed twice. Once in the same journal that we saw before, and also in a journal, the Second International Interdisciplinary Conference on Fundamental and Applied Aspects of Speech and Language. It was published in Belgrade in the winter of 2004. Now, here is another one on the Twin Towers. Here we have Migdalot Ta'amim, the Twin Towers. And in Greek you see Yishmael, but look in the column going down, Chaf Gimel Elul. The 23rd of Elul, which in 2001 was September 11th. So here you have the exact date. Okay? Now look at the text. Vayifol min ha'am bayom hahu k'shloshet alfei ish. You have fell of the people that day around 3,000. And Rips was wondering, why does it say 3,000 when there were 10,000 at least that were killed? But over the period of 2 weeks, the number kept on going down and down and down until it reached about 3,000. And here you have it accurately in the text itself. Some of you may remember Saddam Hussein. He was captured on December 13th, 2003. That's Saddam Hussein in his glory. When he was captured, and here's the code. Nilkad in red. Nilkad captured, brown, sorry, Nilkad. Goes from one line up to the other. Nilkad captured, and then in red, Hussein. And look at the text. By Yilkadu, they captured. Here again, there's a hint that something is in the text. The probability for this, and by the way, Tikrit, the place where he was captured, and probability of 68,000 to 1, that you could find this just by chance. Remember that 68 times stronger than what the peer review is required. Here we have another Hussein, and you have 18 Kislev, which is December 13th of 2003. That's when he was actually captured. It's the same captured and Hussein that you saw before. The one in red is the same one, the one in blue is a new one. 671,000 to 1, that means that it's very, very strong in terms of believing that it's real. It didn't happen just by chance. That's the exact measure. Here you have again Hussein, El Atuloi, to the gallows, which he was hung. And this tells you the exact date. The same Hussein that you saw in the previous slide, exactly the same one, the Test Tavis, which is December 30th, 2006, is just when he was hung. A peaceful beach in Thailand, December 26th, 2004. That's a tsunami, and it was actually found by Rabbi mathematician Glazerson, but it was evaluated by Elio Ritz. He gave it over to me when we were jointly speaking in the UK. I think it was in London. Asia, tsunami. Notice that they actually share a letter, the Yud of tsunami. But look at the text. Mayim lahem homa. The water was a wall to them. And below, the same thing, the water was a wall. And Mesal Tzvasayam, dead on the shore. There were hundreds of thousands of people dead on the shore. And you know, when a tsunami is coming at you, it looks like a wall of water. Okay, does anyone know where in the Torah this is?
Flood.
The splitting of the sea, exactly. And the splitting of the sea is only one of two places. There's only two places in the entire Torah that talks about people drowning. One is this one, the other one is the flood. Okay, the probability of it being found right smack in the middle of either one of them, given the size of the Torah, is 3,900 to 1. So here you have one particular point of the connection to the text. And by the way, there's another experiment, which we're not going to talk about because it's too technical, in which Nachum Bambach actually does an experiment that proves mathematically, with a very strong probability, that there is in fact a connection, at least in some cases, between the text and the code. Not necessarily in all. I don't know how you even do that. February 1st, 2003. Remember this man? Ilan Ramon, the astronaut on the Columbia spacecraft, which blew up. Here we have Maves al Columbia, death on Columbia, and Ilan Ramon. Now, this is an example of where, not that they're so close, but Ilan Ramon is a very short skip for the number of letters in there. The probability is 1 in 300, which means that you probably shouldn't believe it, although you've seen enough to say that it could be. But I'm just showing you because it's interesting. There are, in fact, other examples in which the probabilities are 10,000 to 1 of the same effect, of small, very small skips, but they're not as interesting as this one. Fukushima, Japan, March 11, 2011, the Daiichi nuclear reactor. And here we have Re'idat Adama, an earthquake, which was the cause of the tsunami, of course. Mashber Atami, a nuclear meltdown, which is what happened. Japan, and the exact date. The Hey Adar to base, which in 2011 was March 11th. This was found, by the way, by Professor Robert Harold. The probability I'm giving you is not his, it's mine, because he had a much smaller probability, but I always review how that's calculated, and I didn't agree with his calculation. And so I assumed there were certain parts that were not a priori, parts that were, and so I ignored the parts that he claimed that he had, which were not a priori. He just based it on the part that was clearly a priori, and I got a probability was not as significant as what he had. His was about 3 times or 4 times smaller, still very significant. Bombay, or Mumbai, the new name, November 26, 2008, the attack on Mumbai and on the Bet Chabad in Bombay. And here we have a tableau that was found by Dr. Moshe Katz. It was given to me by Eliyahu Rips. The top part, which I'm expanding now, simply has the word terror 3 times. The bottom part, you will see the word kara, sefer, to tear a sefer, because a sefer Torah was torn by a stray bullet from the machine gun that one of the terrorists was holding. Torah, as you can see, going up in blue, and Bet Chabad going down in the middle over there, and going to the right in green, Bombay, in Bombay. Now, do we have a few minutes extra? Can I go over, or we have another class coming in here?
No, there's no classes after this.
There isn't. Okay, so if you need to leave, you can leave, but the talk will go on for another, somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes at most. No more than 10 minutes, probably closer to 7 or 8. Okay, so if you want to stay, you can stay. Now, what happened was that there was something else about this code that I didn't show you. I purposely didn't show it to you. But it really startled me. And it startled me so much that I decided that I was going to present this here at Eshet Torah. But I was going to preface it to say, I don't know if this is significant or not. There's no probability calculated. Rips didn't calculate probability here. Dr. Katz never does, I don't think. But I'm just going to show you is something of interest, an esoteric observation, if you will. So I decided that the night before I came here, I was visiting Durham with my wife, and we were having a nice social get-together, and it's like, you ever see two Israelis argue, right? The noses are about this far apart. So, if you're an American, as I am, and especially if you're an older guy, people think you're a pushover, right? So, show them you're not a pushover. So I have to keep myself up to speed on how to argue with an Israeli. And I knew exactly how to get to Rome Vista, because he's the most careful of all the researchers. And I casually said to him, Daron, look at this code. And I showed him this. And he looked at it for a few moments. He looked at me and he said, probability. That's the only thing that matters. I don't care what it looks like. What's the probability, right? And I said, there is none. And he just took the paper and threw it away. It's meaningless. And then I said, I'm going to present this tomorrow at Aish. What? You are going to present this? You're going to ruin your reputation. You're going to ruin my reputation. And our noses on this part. We're screaming at each other. The two wives ran out of the room. This went on for about 15 minutes. And finally I said to him, Daron, you're not going to change my mind, so we may as well stop. So he stopped on a dime. The women came back into the room and we continued our nice social interaction. The next day, I'm driving on Highway 1 to Aish, and my cell phone rings. You're supposed to answer your cell phone when you're on the highway. If you're holding it, that was before Bluetooth and all that kind of stuff, right? Especially in Israel. But the Israelis do. If the Israelis can do it, I can do it too. And answer the phone, there's the wrong wisdom. You must present this code. What was this turnaround? We see it turn out that the Rome wisdom knew there was one way to stop me from presenting it. And that was, if he investigated it, and he could calculate the probability and show that it was not significant. And this is what he found. Here's the word terror, the kefet, attack, the bet kabad, and the Bombay, the same as before, and Islami. And he was able to calculate the probability. Islamic terror attack in Bet Kabad in Bombay, 666,000 to 1. Which is very, very significant. It means this didn't happen by chance. Now, what was it about this code that intrigued me? That I was going to present it in spite of the fact that there was no probability. See, remember I told you that the Torah was torn by a stray bullet? Well, there's the tear. That's a picture off the internet of the Torah code, the Torah that was torn. Now, I don't know if there's anyone over here who can read it and have to really be good, but can you read what it says at the arrow there? Part of the Torah that is? It's really hard because it was blurry. I did try to fix it up. What? Very good. After the death of Aaron's two sons. Right. So, here we go. Here's the code again. Here's where the line is plus it. Blow it up over here so you can see it better. There you have it. And where is the tear? Right on top of the code. That means that 3,300 years ago, when God gave us the Torah, he knew that 3,000 years later, a stray bullet from a machine gun is going to tear through a Torah scroll at the base Chabad, and this particular picture was going to be published on the internet. Now, do you know why I was intrigued? Anyone know what this is?
Coronavirus.
The coronavirus. That's right. Here we have corona. And here we have the GIF, virus. Yifros will increase exceedingly. Wuhan. It's in China. Probability, 6,000 to 1. Again, strong probability. Not as strong as some of them, but strong, but 6 times stronger than the peer reviewers said that's what we need in order to believe in it.
And most other things still only require 20.
Excuse me?
Most of the time they only require 20, you said. They require
120. Yeah, but most people agree that 120 is just, but they're now suggesting 1 in 1,000, 1 in 100. 1 in 100, that should really cover us, right? We're dealing with everything above 1 in 1,000 and more. So, what are the scientific standards for validating a discovery? Repeatability by other experts in the field, peer-reviewed by experts in the field, and published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. It's been validated by 6 different researchers who have published through peer review, 14 scientific papers published through peer review, and the papers were published, in case you thought maybe it was just one journal that went ape over Torah codes, in 5 different scientific journals. And what about all the conflict about this, the controversy? There's no refutation of any of the papers published after the first Great Rabbi's experiment. There was a lot of controversy. Everything afterward, no controversy at all. Now, what does that mean? I want to ask you a question. Supposing you see 2 people having a debate, and a whole crowd of people gathers around, and one guy says, I'm going to prove to you that I'm right. And he says whatever he says, and the other guy says, no, I'm going to show you that you're wrong, and I'm disproving your proof, and here's the proof, and I'm going to show you that I'm right. And it goes back and forth, back, crowd gathers around, and finally one of them says, forget about all this nonsense. I'm going to give you one proof that I'm right, and that's it. And this is it. And the other guy looks at it and walks away. And 12, 13 years later, he can't be found. He's still around, but doesn't say a word. Who won the debate? Clearly the guy who was able to answer all the questions, not the guy who walked away because he didn't have an answer. And that's exactly what you have here. Because again, the criterion is, if you say I'm wrong, show me where I made a mistake. And they can't find a mistake in any of those. 4 of these papers, of these 13 papers that were published, proved directly that the Great Rabbi's experiment was valid. And the city's experiment that I did as well. One of them actually shows that the effect of the Great Rabbis are not only encoded in the book of Genesis, but also in the part of the Torah afterward, for thousands and thousands of letters. It continues, the code continues. And that's the strongest proof of any statistical effect. Namely, you say it happens over here, show me another data set in which you see the same thing. And the other paper actually took some of the lists of rabbis that were assembled by the critics and showed that they're encoded as well. And the response, silence. Absolutely nothing. Okay, again, the Torah, 2,000 years old minimum, and here we have all kinds of stuff encoded that can't be found a mistake by any of the mathematical geniuses that exist in this world, the critics, peer reviewers, and it's found in this Torah that's 2,000 years old. Things that happened between the 9th and the 18th century, things that happened just a decade ago, things that are happening just a few years ago. And that's it. Thank you for staying.
Thank you.